Today is the first Sunday of the Christian season of Advent. The dictionary defines Advent of the arrival of a notable person, thing, or event. Advent is the first season of the Christian church year. It begins today, the fourth Sunday before Christmas, and culminates with the birth of the Savior Jesus, which is celebrated as Christmas Day. Each week of Advent leading up to this blessed event focuses on a different theme: hope, then peace, then joy, and finally love, represented by a different candle on this Advent wreath. The first candle we're going to light today, for this week, is focused on hope. For Christians, the hope is connected to the fact that the Savior is coming, not only through recalling the story of the birth of Jesus, but also in anticipation of his triumphant return to once and for all overcome the evils of the world. If you are one of the 2.3 billion folks for whom this is the foundation of your belief system, this is a joyful time indeed. And I don't know about you, but some days it can feel like there is more evil in the world than I could possibly ever hope to eradicate on my own. And it can be comforting to think that a Savior is on his way to just fix the whole mess for us. I've actually read a good bit about Jesus, and although I struggle with some parts of the story, I surely at least try to live my life aligned with the lessons that he shared. I do unto others, I try to share what I have, I try to welcome the stranger. If the rest of the story is right, hopefully that'll be enough to end up on the good side of things. And either way, this seems like a good instruction manual for how to be a genuinely good human being. Unfortunately, my responsible search for truth and meaning hasn't allowed me to completely embrace the rest of the narrative. My interpretation of the prophecies of the past tell me that if there is ever to be peace on earth, it's going to have to begin with me and y'all. Still, that does seem like a daunting task for one person or even 100 people. So today I am going to join with my Christian siblings and light this first candle of Advent, the candle of hope, with a prayer that it will at least help light my way through the ever-expanding darkness of this season. The Sunday after the election, I asked if, regardless of party, you thought the world was going in the wrong direction in one way or another. And after I asked that, I looked out, every single person that I could see raised their hand. Every single person. It was amazing. We never agree about anything. Seem to agree about that. So given that I know there are a variety of beliefs in this room, this begs the next question. Are you waiting for a Savior to come and clean up this mess? Or are you committed to being part of the solution? Whenever I'm thinking about hope, I often turn to my favorite book on the subject, Joanna Macy's 2012 work, Active Hope. I will confess that a rereading of this now a decade-plus old work does feel a bit hopeful in light of where we find ourselves today. But it's also realistic in the ways that any work addressing social change must be. The reality is that deep societal level change doesn't happen overnight, but rather requires long, intentional struggle characterized by stops and starts and a few steps forward and sometimes many steps backwards. Macy begins by naming uncertainty as a pivotal psychological reaction of our times. And she rightly names that things that are too depressing to talk about tend to remain an unspoken presence in the back of our minds. She describes this reality as one of the greatest dangers of our times because it deadens our response. But then, even if we are willing to face that reality, things can feel overwhelming, and we wonder if we can really do anything about it anyway. Macy's prescription, then, is a journey that strengthens and deepens our aliveness, an approach that she labels active hope. To her view of things, as well as to mine, hope is actually a practice. It is something to do rather than something to have. We take an honest look at the way things are, we consider what we hope was different, and then we take steps to try to bring those changes to life. Rather than proceeding forward only when we feel hopeful, we let our intentions of how we want things to be guide our actions. Macy frames her concepts in 3 different stories, which she names Business as Usual, The Great Unraveling, and The Great Turning. If you're alive and you occasionally read the news, you can likely imagine the contents of the first 2 stories. But that great new turning to a new way of being still feels a little bit of a long way off. And yet there is compelling evidence that changes are happening in ways both large and small around the globe that portend a seismic shift from an industrial society committed only to economic growth to a more life-sustaining society committed to the healing and recovering of our shared world. This is the effort that I commit myself to, and I hope you are willing to join me. Macy's prescription includes 5 different components, several of which you will see we are already working on here in this community. Any one of these concepts on their own are not likely enough to strengthen us collectively to manifest the changes that we hope to see in the world. But taken together and practiced first individually and then collectively over time, these prescriptions do offer a roadmap we need to guide us out of the mess we have collectively gotten ourselves into. The first practice she suggests is cultivating a sense of gratitude. This was the entire focus of last week's sermon and the focus of the holiday that just passed. But as a reminder, relegating our thankfulness to a single day per year doesn't provide nearly enough medicine to cure what ails us. Most all of the ancient wisdoms tell us that we have to cultivate gratitude for the abundant gifts we have given each and every day, or even better yet, in each and every moment of our being. Is gratitude already a part of your ongoing practice? Because if it's not, there's no way you will ever have the strength needed to do the work of the next steps. We talk about these things each week, but it really only makes a difference if you take these things and if we take these things and bring them forward to the life. I have to work on this stuff myself. Remaining fully conscious of the gifts that life on this planet has the potential to provide is essential fuel for the rest of the work we are called to do if we are going to have any chance of saving this miracle that we have been given. Do you have a gratitude practice that helps keep those blessings front and center of your consciousness? If not, now is the time to begin. And there are plenty of resources out there to help you get started. Macy's second prescription actually addresses the opposite of this. She compels us to honor the pain that we feel for the things that we know are currently broken in this world. Once you recognize a building is on fire, you tend to quickly move into action, right? But if you refuse to acknowledge the initial signs that maybe something is wrong, you're more unlikely to move. It's the same with the world. If you are paying it all attention, we know that the world is on fire. But in our little room, in our little comfortable part of the world, maybe the only thing that is impacting us is just a faint smell of smoke far off somewhere. It's easy enough to ignore until it's too late. This is the reason for this part of Macy's advice. If we choose to simply ignore the problems that we know exist, there won't ever be enough heat compelling us to take different actions. In Buddhism, allowing our heart to be stirred by the suffering of others is appreciated as a strength. In fact, in nearly every spiritual tradition, compassion is considered to be the central spiritual guide. But our society tells us to avoid these truths. We are compelled to avoid negative feelings at all costs, which sets up avoidance of discomfort as a default strategy. And if we avoid hard truths for too long, they begin to seem too heavy to bear. So we then close off, or just try to numb it, or just try to pretend that it doesn't exist. This is not the way forward towards our salvation. When we allow ourselves to actually touch the depths of our real despair, we find that the pit is not bottomless. When we are willing to see the truth, a shift can occur. And it is this shift that is required to move us into action. But just knowing these things, that things is a mess, isn't enough. As Dr. J. William Worden's classic test on grief notes, accepting the loss is only the first step, but we actually have to feel the pain of grief. Thankfully, we're going to have an expert on grief here in this pulpit next week, so I don't have to dive too much more deeply into this step here. Suffice it to say, for our purposes today, that we need not only notice the pain of the world, but we actually need to be willing to feel it. This is what's needed to rouse us to respond. What is troubling you about the world today? Breathe into that question. Sit with it. Be willing to feel it. Let it move through you. We must feel connections to the problems if we are ever to feel compelled to do something about them. The third of Macy's prescriptions is to develop a wider sense of self. Our culture has developed such a deeply individualized sense of self and selfishness that it is easy to imagine that this is actually the natural state of the human condition. But our current disconnected way of experiencing the world is not the only way. Our Unitarian Universalist faith reminds us that of the truth that we are all connected. That what happens to one happens to all. And this is the key to the next step in Macy's process. Psychologist Marilyn Brewer writes, when the definition of self changes, the meaning of self-interest and self-serving changes as well. The trend towards individualism sets us up against each other. Instead of encouraging us to pull together at a time of planetary emergency, the dominant culture ethic has become one of chasing personal advantage. Macy says that experiencing the wider identity of our connected self does not mean losing our individuality. It's actually the opposite. Through finding and playing our unique role within a community, we actually feel more strongly a part of it. This is why I believe joining and contributing to the ongoing success of an intentional community such as this one is another key to our collective survival. See what we're doing here? Gratitude last week, grief next week, being here in community. We're already following these steps, and I didn't even think about this before I reread this book. So maybe this isn't so impossible after all. Maybe we can actually do this. What would it take within our current system to shift the survival instinct of humanity from our own self-interest to act for the well-being, a perspective where we align our self-interest more with all of life? Within Buddhism, that intention is known as bodhicitta. Bodhicitta moves our focus from personal well-being to collective well-being. When the central organizing priority becomes the widening of all life, then what happens through us is actually the recovery of our world. The fourth aspect of Macy's model is about a concept of power. It is this part that actually gives me the most hope, but it is also the place that brings me the most pause given the current state of affairs. When she wrote this book in 2012, it might have been easier to see the shift she describes about power as moving from power over to power with, finally beginning to emerge. But here again, I see our Unitarian Universalist faith leading us in the right direction. The story of this faith's history is the story of rebelling against the power over model. Our ancestors first rejected a church, trying to tell them how things were. We then rebelled against a tyrant king trying to have power over us. And as a result, we moved to the New World and we shifted power from a single centralized authority to the individual churches that organized our communities. From there, power has shifted from government to capitalism, and we Unitarian Universalists continue to resist being told what to do. This primary aspect of this faith's DNA, resistance to any individual or institution that tries to exert too much influence over us, is a source of our strength. We are still in the minority and we are still trying to figure out how to fully leverage that shared power, but it is clear that the power over model is just not sustainable. In our current society, power is viewed as a commodity. Having power is having something that others do not. Money, weapons, resources, or even information. Macy notes, and I think this is one of the most prescient points in her books, that when information gives it advantage, it becomes a tradable asset. And as a result, valuable knowledge gets hidden away, and public knowledge is held back in secrecy. Even votes in elections are now thought to be buyable. She says the power to shape the direction of our society has become a commodity that can be bought and sold, increasingly removed from the hands of ordinary people. And because of this, power itself has become suspect, which can lead us with authority. Macy calls us in this step to reimagine power as a capacity-building alternative. She speaks of the power that gains its strength from relationship. Again, exactly what our faith encourages us to practice. In one of my first sermons to you, you may or may not remember a year ago, I spoke about the concept of emergence, highlighted by the work of Adrienne Marie Brown. The central tenet of her philosophy is the idea that the all is made of nothing but a collection of the small, and that the only way to fundamentally change a system is to change its component parts. The actions we take here to practice sharing power with others to amplify its potential positive effects may seem inconsequential, but when you realize that there are millions of others across the globe continuing to practice the same thing in their attempts to redirect a world that is clearly headed in the wrong direction, it becomes easier to realize that our efforts towards strengthening this community are never in vain. The key to the concept of emergence is that it reminds us that we don't necessarily need to see the results of our actions immediately for them to be worthwhile. Macy says that if we depend on seeing the positive results of our individual steps, we'll avoid the challenges that seem beyond what we can visibly influence. And I guess for me, that's where faith comes in. Macy's final prescription for hope is based in community. There is a reported epidemic of loneliness in our industrialized world, and the only cure for that is human connection. Once again, this is what this community is designed to create. You've already developed a small community here that many feel a deep sense of connection to. My role as a minister is to help you expand that feeling that you've created here out to the wider community, which is ultimately then connected to our nation and ultimately to our world. Small is all. That is the way. It just takes commitment and a little bit of time. This has been a concept-heavy sermon, I know, and I should probably wrap up for today. When it comes to hope, the true source of mine is actually visiting this week and is sitting here listening to me speak. The truth is, as much wisdom as I see in her that gives me hope, that's not the direction I think hope should really be flowing. As a parent, my responsibility is to instill hope for the future into my daughter. And this, beloveds, is why I do what I do. And it's probably why you do what you do. I try to remain grateful for all of the blessings that I have been given. I try to be realistic about the struggles we collectively face. And I try to remember that we are all connected, that my actions matter, and that what happens to one happens to us all. I'm trying to lead in a manner that demonstrates that shared power is not only possible, but it is actually strong enough to overcome the current model of power over that we know only leads to death and destruction. And I try to strengthen each community that I become a part of, because I believe that revitalized communities are essential for healthy societies. Thank you for giving me hope, my child. I hope the actions of my life add a little bit of hope to yours. The good news is, I'm not alone. All of these folks here are helping us. And so are the many million of others, just like them, around the world. We got this. We do. We just have to ensure that our hope is always an active hope. May it be so. Closing words are a quote from Barbara Kingsolver. The very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for. And the most you can do is live inside that hope. Not admire it from a distance, but live right in it, under its roof.